So, does this work? Yes, everyone can hear me? Good, perfect. Good morning, everyone. Let's start the first academic session at CPDP 2026. This is the first of 3 academic sessions that we have scheduled for this conference. And the focus really is on the legal perspective, legal science perspective. And what that means in practice is we have 3 presentations that are about, well, mostly GDPR issues, and then we have one on dark patterns. And even though they are, about GDPR, they are still from completely different perspectives. So I'm really looking forward to hear more about the presentations and about the papers that these presentations will represent. My name is Alicja Joanna Kucharska. I am a PhD candidate at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society. And it is really my honor to introduce today's speakers. They wrote excellent papers. We have 3 speakers in person and 1 speaker who's joining us from Japan. And now I would like to ask each of you to just shortly introduce yourself and your paper, and then we will jump into the presentations.
Okay, everyone. So first of all, I would like to thank CPDP and Ms. Kucharska for coordinating this panel. My name is Luisa Maciel Perez. I'm currently finalizing my master's, European Master in Law, Data and AI. It's organized by Dublin City University. And I am a legal professional from Brazil with past work in international research institutions. And my paper is titled The Jure Brussels Effect, Lessons to the European Union about Digital Regulatory Frameworks According to the Experiences of Brazil and Mexico.
Hi everyone, good morning and thanks for being here, and I hope someone will join during the next few minutes. I'm Stephanie from Maltzan. I'm working as a research associate at FITS Karlsruhe. I'm a doctoral researcher as well, and the topic of my PhD is machine learning, as the paper will be as well. I mean, of course, just a high-level overview. I work at the intersection of law and technology since already 9 years, and my background is legal with technical courses that I've also attended. Recently pursued another master at the University of Maastricht, and yeah, I'm happy to be here, and up to you.
Yeah, thanks also for all being here. My name is Krämer, and I'm currently an assistant professor at Erasmus University Rotterdam, where I am looking into data protection law and empirical legal studies. So the paper that I will present today, that I have been writing together with my co-author Alexander Ekberts, is called Privacy Preference and Cookie Choice. Is design more important than what you want? So you see, it's also like an online experiment. So I hope I can give you some nice ideas of what we actually did in this study.
And if we could have our online speaker introduce herself as well.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you to CPDP for facilitating my remote participation. My name is Stella, and I'm currently studying in Kyushu University. But the paper today I'll be presenting is from my LLM thesis, which is basically a selected ASEAN member review on ARCO Rights as a GDPR legacy. Thank you.
Perfect, then excellent. Thank you so much. So this session is as follows. Each speaker gets around 12 minutes to present their paper. And then we have approximately 5 minutes after each presentation for questions from the audience. And then let's hope at the end we will have a little bit of time to have a little bit more of a discussion. Yeah, I'm super excited to hear more, and I give the floor to our first speaker.
So good morning, everyone. This article was actually co-written with Ms. Mariana De Hoyos, who unfortunately couldn't be here, and it's titled The Jure Brussels Effect, Lessons to the European Union about Digital Regulatory Frameworks According to the Experience of Brazil and Mexico. So to start it all, why did we choose such a topic? So 2026 is kind of a landmark year. It marks the 10-year anniversary of the GDPR. It is kind of this golden standard for other jurisdictions to follow or to imitate to a point. And when we think about Brussels effect, as this theory proposed back in 2012, it's normally the first regulation that comes to mind. But the idea of this article is to demonstrate that the Brussels effect goes beyond the GDPR, because EU has pushed in the past decade a very dense and complex digital regulatory framework that also includes the DSA, the AMA, the Data Act, the AI Act. So to start, what we observe is that EU has this kind of pioneer position in regulating digital markets, but other jurisdictions actually face two options right now. They either can create their own digital regulatory framework from scratch, or they can be inspired by an already existing one, like the EU one, to emulate or complement it. And when we look at Latin America, we see that most countries will choose the second option. So for this paper, why do we choose then to analyze the cases of Brazil and Mexico? And that's quite an easy answer. The Brussels effect is framed within an economic rationale, and Brazil and Mexico stand in Latin America as the countries with the largest economies by national GDP. And because of that, they have the two most important digital markets. Besides that, we also have to consider that both countries have a very long history of the EU that goes back to its historical colonial ties and have already developed some kind of national digital regulatory framework in which we can analyze. So this paper is framed, as I presented, in the idea of the Jure Brussels Effect. So better analyzing it is this idea to understand the influence of the European Union over third countries. So the Brussels effect per se will be this idea of the liberty adoption of law from one jurisdiction into another without the former actively imposing it or the latter willingly adopting it. When we actually analyze Professor Bradford's theory, she presents 5 conditions for it to happen. And here we see that the EU fulfills them all. The first one being that it has a large domestic market. EU, it is the world's biggest single market. It has a significant regulatory capacity. What we can also see, for example, the ability through the GDPR for EU to impose fines for data controllers wherever they are in the world. Then the propensity for strict standards, once again, we can quote GDPR. It establishes the idea that we are going to have high and uniform level of protection in many regulations. Then jurisdiction is unavoidable, and EU does that through regulating inelastic markets like data. So you cannot just move from one jurisdiction to another to avoid the law. And then eventually there's a voluntary adoption by third parties. That's what we called non-divisibility of standards. So corporations will tend to adopt an restricted standard because it's easier, more economically viable than to create standards for each jurisdiction. And that's normally what we understand as a de facto effect. The Jure Brussels effect then is kind of like this intensified version of the de facto effect. That is when legislators from third countries will then incorporate these kind of foreign standards into their own laws. So the idea of the paper is to then analyze whether Brazil and Mexico challenge or complement these regulations. So why then we choose the GDPR and the AI Act? Easy answer once again, GDPR, it is still the core example of the Brussels effect. And when we analyze Latin America, 73% of these countries have already some kind of data protection law, mainly inspired by the GDPR, and because of the historical colonial ties between the two regions. On the AI Act, although a new regulation, what we observe is that it has a strong potential to export EU standards. And the boom of AI has shown that other countries need to regulate. So Brazil and Mexico have not been behind. They have been proposing legislative bills that we should analyze. So when we start the analysis for Brazil, it's quite interesting. So we have the General Personal Data Protection Law that was approved in August 2018. That's just merely 3 months after the GDPR came into effect. In theory, data protection is already a new status under the Constitution from 2022. It is a fundamental right. And what we see is that the LGPD is almost a perfect mirror of the GDPR. And why? The similarities are quite striking. We have several aspects from cross-border jurisdiction, privacy principles, rights of data subjects, and we see few modifications and adaptations for Brazil. But the 2 first are the ones that stand out, and I would like to explain why. We have more flexible lawful basis for processing. Out of the 4 new ones compared to the GDPR, 2 are quite interesting. The first one is that Brazil creates processing for the protection of credit. And the second one, protection of health in process carried out by medical institutions. So these are 2 very concerning aspects that so far the GDPR would fall within potentially a legitimate interest basis. And then a second issue that Brazil tries to solve, and it's quite interesting, is that the issue of anonymous data. So in both regulations, anonymous data wouldn't fall within its scope. However, Brazil understands that when anonymous data is used for assessing characteristics of a natural person, i.e. profiling, that anonymous data will fall eventually within its scope. So it's a quite interesting approach on how to potentially solve two issues that the GDPR has not completely addressed directly. But what about the AI Act? Do we see the same experience of a strong similarity between the regulations? And the answer is kind of. So it's not a mere copy. Brazil doesn't have an AI regulation to this day. We have a very important bill that is on Congress being evaluated by the legislative process. That's Bill 2338. What is important about it is that its original draft was made by a renowned committee of 18 jurists. One of the jurists is Professor Ana Frazão, who explicitly said that the AI Act is a reference. So we can see here she has publicly stated that AI Act was chosen as a model to follow, not only because it was already completed, but also because it is the result of long debates and consensus. Does it reflect the way we analyze the law? And yes, there is some key similarities regarding architecture, risk-based approach, some key definitions. But what we see with the AI Act is that the Jure Brussels Effect is not as strong because we have some much more interesting innovations. First one is that Brazil decides to take an approach that is more similar to the GDPR than the AI Act. It focuses on the individual first and not on the technology. So for that reason, it introduces principles for the implementation of AI and also explicit rights to individuals for AI. What is interesting about it, and it differentiates from the European approach, is that the AI Act focuses on fundamental rights in relation to economic interests and not the individuals, and that similar provisions will only be addressed in the GDPR, what may create a potential regulatory gap. Another aspect that I would like to highlight is that Brazil actually has a full section in its bill dedicated to civil responsibility, something that is still absent in the EU framework. And it also presents a very interesting way of assessing AI risk level with a preliminary assessment and future reevaluations in a way to future-proof the regulation. So what we observe with the AI bill is that it's a new way of approaching regulations that aims to fit Brazil's reality, not just imitating potential global north perspectives, but also internalizing global south necessities. And what about Mexico then? It is a different experience. We would expect that the Jure Brussels Effect is present, and in fact is, as I will demonstrate. So data protection is governed by several legal frameworks in Mexico. There's actually two laws. The first one is the federal law on the protection of personal data held by private parties, which covers only private entities, and that's the one we will discuss. And there's another law that is the general law on the protection of personal data held by obligated parties, which only covers public entities. But why did we choose to discuss the first one? It's interesting because it was enacted before the GDPR, and at the time was already aligned with the OECD guidelines for data protection and the Data Protection Directive, which would be followed by the GDPR. And in 2025, through a series of reforms by decrees, Mexico tried to enhance the harmonization with the GDPR. And at the same time, interestingly, dissolved the INAI, that is the National Institute for Transparency, Access to Information and Protection of Personal Data, the independent supervisory authority. So when we look at the two bills, there's some similarities, but some key differences. So we see some definitions, privacy principles and rights, but the differences are quite more striking. We only have consent as a general legal basis for processing. Mexico does recognize core rights for data subjects, but does not include the very interesting right to data portability. There's an interesting innovation from the GDPR. The regulation also does not cover DPIA, notification obligations under breaches, nor the principle of privacy by design. It doesn't have any mandates for roles as processor, controller, and DPOs. And it has lost its independent supervisory authority with the 2025 reform. So what we observe is that despite Mexico's efforts to enhance its harmonization with GDPR, it does not still reach full convergence in many key elements. On the aspect of AI bills is the same thing. Mexico is still at this initial stages of AI bill. It has actually more than 50 bills going on right now, and there was 2 bills as of January, as when we analyzed this paper, that were the most important. The first one being a law to regulate the use of artificial intelligence, and the second one for ethical, sovereign, and inclusive development of AI. So what is interesting is that the memorandum that explains the reasoning for each law has explicitly stated that they have an interest of aligning with EU standards. So when we analyze the bills in itself, we still see some striking similarities to the EU approach, like risk-based approach, the definitions, AI literacy. But the differences are, once again, what stand out. The first one is that in the law for regulating use of AI, they introduced this idea of technical standards and compliance assessments. That is a way of future-proofing the regulation. And then for me personally and for Mariana, the most interesting would be the second law, which unfortunately has been dropped in the last 3 months, that would include very important aspects of an ethics-driven framework that would define governance across sectors. The bill would contain unique provisions on sustainability and environmental impact of AI. That is a huge issue that we haven't seen with the AI Act. There's very few mention, if I'm not mistaken, there's one mention of sustainability in the AI Act. And then it would also envision a technological environmental impact assessment, so a new way of understanding this potential impact. So to finalize it, our analysis is this idea that Mexico presents a very promising future, but quite unclear. So to conclude, we understand what can then the EU learn based on these experiences. Yes, there's a Brussels effect. However, it will be different from one country to another. Brazil and Mexico are still very core examples of it happening. Nevertheless, the legal frameworks of Latin American countries like Brazil and Mexico actually complement and expand EU standards. They do not raise any conflict. They are a way of incentivizing cooperation, innovation, and trade between the two regions. And there is a reduced, the Jure Brussels Effect in the case of AI Act when we compare to the GDPR. And finally, mainly based on these innovations, the EU can further develop its own digital regulatory framework. So to conclude, if the goal is to obtain a transnational cohesive approach for digital regulatory frameworks and to obtain and enhance legal convergence between countries, what we need is not to just reflect the values and the needs of the global majority in its laws, but also to consider cooperation and discussions between Global North and Global South. Thank you.
Thank you for this. Yes? Is it working? Yes, okay. Now it's working. Thank you for this excellent presentation. Do we have any questions from the audience? We have about 5 minutes to ask. Can we get the microphone?
Hi, my name is Michal. I'm an affiliated researcher at LSTS-VUB. Thank you for a very good presentation. My question would be, there is a substantial difference between GDPR and AI Act. Like GDPR is more an autonomous act and it's like a comprehensive regulation on its own, while AI Act is much more comprehensive. It has to be, it's a framework that it's still being filled, for example, by implementing acts of the European Commission. It's also a product safety regulation, which means it is one of the, it's a part of a bigger group of regulations in the EU. Do you think that that this fact affects the magnitude of the Brussels effect? Yeah, that's basically the question. Thank you.
It's working, I think. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, of course, it does, because as we personally analyze it, what we see is that other countries are struggling to understand the magnitude of the AI Act. As you potentially have explained, we have, for example, codes of practices. They're like being released for GPA models. We have several subjects that are being discussed by the European Commission, and we're expecting future innovations. We have the Omnibus Bill going on at the moment and might question some of the provisions of the AI Act. So all of this, I think, contributes for this potential reduced effect of the AI Act, because at the time that we had the GDPR, it was an easygoing idea that, okay, this is an established framework. It encompasses most of the issues that we will look. And for that reason, it becomes a very easy way to like transpose the provisions of the GDPR into another region. And we have seen not just with Brazil and Mexico, but overall the GDPR, it is the primary example of Brussels effect. But when we analyze the AI Act, there's so many different approaches going on. Latin American countries, especially Brazil and Mexico, it still rely a lot on the EU and its cooperation because of its history and cooperation, and for that we still see it present. But they do understand now that the complexity of the AI Act makes them maybe rethink the way they should approach and what they should change or innovate for their own benefits or adaptations. So yes, I think the complexity doesn't help the Jure Brussels effect.
Any more questions?
Thank you, Frederik from the Belgian Data Protection Authority. Small question, we have analyzed GDPR and AI Act here. Now for us in Europe, of course, the interplay will be a different, very important topic to analyze. Are there any lessons to be learned, for example, in Mexico or Brazil that can help us moving forward with this interplay?
Yes, I would consider that Brazil and Mexico consider that do not have an AI regulation yet. So what I've been seeing with the legislative procedures of both is that they are trying to not only see what has worked elsewhere. So for example, for Brazil, this first draft was conducted after a year of research. A report of 800 pages was published in which they analyze legal frameworks from across the world, and then they analyze that the AI Act was the model to follow. So what we see is that there is this necessity of trying to conciliate the provisions that already exist in the GDPR-like regulations in these countries with the future AI regulation, just because maybe they had more time and already several models outside that they could look and compare, see what works and what doesn't work. So for Brazil and Mexico, what we see is there is this attempt, and that's why the legislative process is taking a while, to try to create a very cohesive framework. Because what we see with the AI Act that I think is quite concerning now is because there are too many doubts on how does it play with the GDPR. I think a good example that comes to mind is the idea of what is the difference to a point and what can we cover with a fundamental rights impact assessment and then a DPIA. And there's too many questions going on and we need an answer about pragmatic things. So yes, I do think that Brazil and Mexico can be looked at as this idea of potentially analyzing the need to create a more cohesive approach between the two and whether provisions actually look at the other regulation before they come out.
Perfect. Now let's move to our second speaker and our second presentation.
Okay, let's maybe a little bit closer. Let's jump to a totally different topic at the intersection of data protection law, machine learning, and the effectiveness of AI governance regime. Welcome everyone to my presentation, Distributed Memory, Unlearning, and the Governance of Forgetting in Large Language Models under the GDPR. The presentation proceeds in 5 steps. First, the functional redefinition of Article 17 GDPR, the classification of machine learning approaches through the taxonomy of deletion and erasure, and finally the 2-tier solution. The starting hypothesis underlying these steps is that personal data may appear not only in training data and outputs, but also in the model itself. Therefore, the central question I ask myself here is whether Article 17 GDPR can be implemented effectively and verifiably once personal data has been absorbed into the model. And this isn't just a theoretical question. The associated tension becomes visible in real-world cases, such as that of Ava Hjalmar Hulman, and sorry to the Norwegians here for the mispronunciation. When prompted, ChatGPT fabricated a detailed, confident, but entirely false story about him murdering his 2 sons, while also including true information about his hometown. And this is not simply a hallucination in a technical sense, not merely an incorrect answer. It is a machine-generated narrative about an individual indefinable person, and it directly affects data protection, dignity, reputation, contextual obscurity, the ability to challenge machine-generated narratives, and actually trust in whether rights actually can be enforced. And this case is significant not only because of the defamatory and dangerous nature of the statement, but also because what it reveals about erasure within LLMs. Under Article 17 GDPR, Hullman would have the right to request erasure, but in a system like ChatGPT, what would that actually involve? What would count as erasure? And how would he or a regulator ever know whether this has actually happened? The starting tension is straightforward. Article 17 GDPR assumes personal data is identifiable and erasable, but that assumption is challenged by LLMs that underpin generative AI systems such as ChatGPT, because Hullman's personal data are not stored as discrete and retrievable records like in databases, which can be isolated and erased. Instead, ChatGPT absorbed Hullman's personal data into its model parameters and reproduced it in its outputs by inferring in new forms across context. Generally, the harmful association, probabilistic reconstruction, these association may appear through, let's say, memorized fragments, learned associations, probabilistic reconstructions, inference, or hallucination, like in that case, which raises the questions, can the right to erasure remain effective in systems built around opacity, probabilistic inference, and distributed memory? If personal data cannot be erased in LLMs, the problem is larger than just one individual complaint. It raises the structural issue of whether EU law can still govern informational memory at scale and informational self-determination. That said, a fundamental right risk remaining formally recognized but becoming practically symbolic. By examining this issue, Article 17 should not be understood only as physical or logical erasure, but also functionally. The legal question is not necessarily whether every trace has been physically destroyed, but whether the controller has effectively neutralized the privacy risk that Article 17 intended to remedy. While CGEU case laws such as Google Pay, Money, and others show that erasure can sometimes be implemented through functional measures such as delisting, anonymization, or restricting access, the LLM context requires, of course, a more demanding assessment. Applied to the use case before, it would not be sufficient merely to block one exact defamatory output if the model can still reproduce it, paraphrase, infer, or reconstruct the false association through other prompts. A functional erasure in LLMs must therefore address not only access to the information, but also the model's distributed memory and the continuing influence of the data or association within its parameters. Therefore, in the strictest sense, erasure means that the model approaches a state it would have had if the relevant data point had never been encountered during training, and this can be assessed through three criteria. First, the model should no longer be able to produce the personal data or derived information when directly queried. Secondly, the data point should have only negligible influence on the model's predictions or behavior. And third, statistical or probing methods should not reliably detect that the data had previously been present in the model. Now, the gold standard is clear. The next question is which technical methods can approximate it? And this is where machine unlearning comes into play. Machine unlearning is a technical vocabulary for post-training intervention with the aim to remove a specific data point's influence from a trained model. And the strongest approach is exact unlearning, but why not just retraining? The simple answer is currently scale. In most cases, of course, it's dependent on the model and the access to the training data, but models like GPT-4 reportedly have over 1 trillion parameters, and retraining costs tens of millions of dollars. Not thousands, millions, of course. Removing just one data point could take weeks, just one data point, and cost around $2 million. So it's clearly not realistic for a erasure request. A more workable exact approach is called CSAR, short for sharded, isolated, sliced, and aggregated. It splits, as you can see in the figure, the data set into small independent shards and slices that can be retrained selectively when an erasure request comes in. Approximate methods, on the other hand, don't remove the data entirely. They just reduce its influence. Simply put, they tweak the model weights to simulate what would have happened if the data had never been included. The examples include fine-tuning, influence suppression, or deliberate misclassification. And in a simplified way, this is shown by the figure where the decision boundary is shifted after fine-tuning. Most systems today use output-level interventions like guardrails, which are not per se machine unlearning. These don't alter or remove information within a model. They simply control what the model outputs. So for instance, if a prompt seems to seek personal information, then the model might refuse to answer or redact parts of its response, as can be seen in this figure. And the trade-offs inherent in all approaches are clear: accuracy versus efficiency versus verifiability. Well, these techniques help reduce the risk of data exposure. Compliance really depends on one key thing: whether any trace of the data is ideally verifiably removed. And to make sense of this, I've created a taxonomy. Under such, I've categorized the machine learning approaches under 3 compliance levels: deletion, erasure, and forgetting. Deletion only removes a record or visible output, but the model's internal influence may remain. Erasure removes the training data and the learned inference, approximating the counterfactual state in which the model never accounted the data. And finally, forgetting is dependent on the access to training data and means that the data point's influence is weakened and become less retrievable or less influential, but it may not be fully eliminated. The main point here on this slide is that not every intervention that reduces exposure should be called erasure. Let me start with the strongest category on the right, erasure. The most complete way to do this would be to retrain the model from scratch without that data. Legally, that is perfect compliance, but it's far beyond what's proportionate. So CSER offers a practical middle ground with the result of an updated, aggregated model in which the contribution of that data point has been purged. It cuts cost and computing time, thus offering a strong form of data removal, but it's still costly and requires architecture that supports such modular unlearning. But conceptually, CSER aligns most closely with the GDPR style erasure. Approximate methods, on the other hand, are in the gray zone. Sorry, I really have to jump now the slides. This one, maybe? No, it's the same. No, it's working. No, yeah. I just have to jump the slide because of the time. I had to change it. This one. Exactly. So approximate methods are on the gray zone. These methods are more feasible in practice as they can be applied ad hoc, reduce the likelihood that the model outputs the false association, and are less costly than retraining, but need to be verifiable to be legally acceptable. The trade-off is accuracy and verifiability. These methods make the model less likely to reproduce personal information, but can't guarantee that no traces remain. Now I have to jump back again. So that is why approximate approaches are conditional. They move the model towards functional erasure, but only if rigorous verification show that residual inference is negligible, non-identifying, and non-inferable. So if training data remains accessible and there is no verification that traces have been removed from a model, the intervention should be classified as deletion rather than erasure. Personal information could, for example, be reintroduced through retraining. And this also explains the distinction between fine-tuning with and without access to the training data. With access, the controller can at least remove the source data from future training and better target the model update. Without access, the controller can only reduce reproducibility or accessibility from the outside. And in that case, the intervention may be closer to deletion or forgetting, with the latter applying if the influence was verifiably removed. Finally, guardrails like output filters on the left side are the weakest category. Now to jump again. They can be implemented quickly and can reduce immediate harm, but as these systems suppress only visible content, that's not erasure from a GDPR perspective. They do not remove the association from the model's internal representations. It's really just a patch, so more like covering a leak with tape instead of fixing the pipe itself. If those filters were removed or bypassed, the harmful information could easily resurface, as seen in the figure where I bypassed the filter easily with different prompting. For that reason, guardrails are best understood as simple deletion, not GDPR-compliant erasure or forgetting. However, this is exactly what OpenAI seems to do based on their policies. So the core message is suppression is not erasure or forgetting. Approximate methods require verification, and only methods that remove learned influence can plausibly satisfy Article 17 GDPR. So as the time's running, I will skip some parts and go directly to the two-tier compliance model. We have mapped out what lawful erasure would actually require in LLMs. So the next step is to look at how we can conceptualize it in LLMs. For now, realistic and proportionate path forward, at least for model providers, would be a layered mitigation strategy, combining immediate fixes with longer-term compliance steps until full unlearning becomes feasible. One idea would be to start training a shadow model using Caesar while continuing to run the existing model with strong safeguards. And building on this, I propose a two-tier approach to handling erasure requests for LLMs. In the first tier, when an erasure comes in, the controller should act quickly, applying targeted fine-tuning or weight editing or other approximate methods to minimize the influence of their data. At the same time, they can strengthen prompt filters and guardrails linked to that information. The goal is to reduce the chance of the model reproducing the data to nearly zero, even if some traces remain internally. In Tier 2, and at the next model update, the data should be completely removed from the training set before retraining. That ensures the new version never counted that information again, achieving full compliance over time. In practice, model providers already retrain periodically to improve accuracy or add new data. So they could batch multiple erasure requests and handle them during these regular retraining cycles. This way, models gradually become fully compliant, while privacy risks stay minimal in the meantime. When we recall the Article 17 GDPR requirement without undue delay, this may fall short here, as well as the possibility that data may be reintroduced into the model, but as the most immediate harm is regulated and taken proportionality into account, this approach is proportionate to the risk posed by the processing and reflects current technical capabilities. But in high-risk situations, say when a model leaks clearly sensitive or false personal data, like in the use case we heard before, this may justifiably require immediate retraining or approximate methods jointly with audits to verify its removal. So from my perspective, at least for now, a layered approach seems to be the most realistic path toward compliance. And to wrap up, the ability to erase or to forget has to be treated as an infrastructure issue. In that sense, enforceable erasure is not only a matter of law or technical constraints, it is about designing AI systems that respect erasure from the outset. And it's about creating institutions that can verify and govern that process while refusing patchwork solutions that do not truly meet the standards. And on this note, I end my presentation because it's already time.
Thank you so much. We can take maybe one question from the audience. No questions? Everything clear? Oh, there is one question there.
Hello, Jure Brussels from the University of Paris 8. Thank you for this very, very, very interesting and useful presentation. I have a question out of curiosity, if you know or if it is known what kind of measures current LLM providers use, if they have made any statements on what they do. You mentioned ChatGPT at some point. Are there, do we know anything about other LLM providers on what they do when and if they receive erasure requests?
So during my research, I focused on ChatGPT, but because it was in the policies of OpenAI, it was the easiest to spot. But I've compared it to other providers as well, and what's mostly done is actually output suppression because it's the easiest, it's the fastest, it's not costly at all. And honestly, it is not enforced. So Article 17 is not enforced right now in models. So usually providers and deployers, they take the easiest and less costly route, unfortunately. But there is a lot of research going on. There was, for instance, already a couple of years ago, a competition from Google. So that means that the big players researching this field as well. But the question is, first, what the regulators, how they will see how it can be enforced. Because right now, it's superficially researched. It is mentioned by regulators, but there is no harmonized or even a way to move into a direction that could really enforce Article 17. So, short answer, output suppression. But hopefully in future there will be more fine-tuning approaches seen. But I can imagine that the more court cases will appear, then maybe fine-tuning and more sensitive cases will move forward.
Great, then we can move to our third presentation by Dr. Krämer.
Thank you. So my name is Jure Krämer, and I will present to you today a project that I've been working on with my co-author, Alexander Eckberts, who unfortunately cannot be here today. And I want to talk with you about something that most of us encounter every day without thinking too much about it, cookie banners. And specifically, we want to explore, when you click accept all, is that actually really your choice, or is the design of the banner doing most of the work? And I think by the end of this talk, you have a bit of a clear idea of what is happening. So to just give you a bit of background, where this research originates from is that there are design features that steer users towards actions that are usually beneficial for a company, most of the time at the expense of privacy, which are known as dark patterns. And dark patterns have received quite some regulatory attention in the past. For instance, the Digital Services Act as well as the Data Act introduced some new regulation of dark patterns, and they justify it on the distortion of user autonomy. But that actually made us quite interested in pursuing this study because we know that dark patterns to a certain extent affect choices, but do they actually really also moderate our privacy preferences? And when we look at the research that has been done already, we actually see that most research has focused on this link of dark patterns influencing choice. And in the context of consumer law and also in the privacy context, we have seen great research that actually looks, for instance, descriptively which dark patterns are out there, but also which kind of design features steer user behavior. However, what has received less attention and what we want to study in our experiment is the question whether preferences actually translate into your choice and whether dark patterns can break this link. And that is exactly what our study sets out to examine. And in a nutshell, our research question is the following: what is more influential for consent, privacy preferences, or consent banner design? And before I dive into our results, I want to go with you through our experimental design, because we approached this question by conducting an online experiment. So let me start first with the three hypotheses that we wanted to explore. So first, we expect that dark patterns increase the likelihood of users consenting to cookies. And that is already fairly established in the literature, but we wanted to explore this in a controlled setting. Second, we expect that people with stronger privacy preferences also are less likely to accept cookies. And that's, of course, super intuitive, but interestingly, has never really been tested in a study before. And third, and most interestingly, we asked, or we're gonna explore, whether privacy concerns actually moderate the effect of dark patterns, or in other terms, whether people who care more about privacy are also more able to defend themselves against dark patterns. And here's how our study was designed. So we invited participants via a link on Prolific to our online study, and when they were clicking on the link, they were directed to a website specifically programmed for this study. And when they were entering this website, they already got the different treatments. So either they were presented with one of 3 dark patterns or a baseline cookie banner. After that, we gave them some information for the study, asked for their consent and demographics, and then the very interesting part comes, we elicited privacy preferences. And the instrument that we first tried, we called VTA, or willingness to accept. And this is an instrument that we designed for the study to address a concern that stated privacy preferences may not predict behavior, which is also commonly known as the privacy paradox. So what we did is we went beyond asking participants what they value. We actually gave them a choice with real consequences. So they could log in with their Google account, which shares information. And we asked if they would be willing to do so, and if yes, to which amount. So what would it take to compensate them for that? Unfortunately, though, even though we designed this instrument with a lot of thought behind it, it did not turn out to be statistically significant. So I will not be going into detail about it today, but just know that we tried to address this limitation. Because the second instrument that gave us statistical results is the so-called IUPC-8 instrument. And this is already an established instrument that asks participants 8 different questions and then elicits the privacy concerns participants have. In the second part then, we went to the main survey. We asked about privacy strategies and literacy that users have. And after that, we came to the reflection part. So we actually confronted participants with the banner and the decision that they made at the beginning of the study and informed them about third-party cookies. We then asked them if they actually regret their choice, how difficult it was for them, and if they feel deceived by the dark pattern they were presented with. And we conducted the study last year in Germany, in a German-speaking audience, and we have 1,142 observations. So just to give you an idea, this is the landing page that users saw when they were actually visiting the page. So we tried to keep it as neutral as possible when you use kind of like this software that designs studies, which is called O3. And what you see also is that it's, of course, German, but in the following slides, I translated the cookie banners so you have also an idea what was written on them. So let's actually go into our results and the different treatments that participants faced. So what you see here is the first treatment, and that's kind of the baseline cookie. So accepting cookies was as easy as rejecting them, and interestingly, even here, we have an acceptance rate of 68%, which we actually found quite high because we expected more like a 50-50 percentage. But this is kind of the baseline acceptance rate that is also kind of our baseline to compare the different dark patterns to it. The next treatment and the first dark pattern is an aesthetic manipulation. So what you see here is that the reject button is less visible. And I mean, that's probably a dark pattern that you're all well aware of. And most interestingly, less people accepted with this dark pattern than with our baseline. We also do have an explanation for that, so we can maybe dive into that in the discussion. And then with our second treatment, dark pattern treatment, we do see kind of a difference. So what you see here is also, again, a very known treatment or dark pattern where you have to actually click twice to reject because the reject button is hidden in the settings. And unsurprisingly, the acceptance rate jumps quite high, and you also see quite a big difference to our baseline design. The last dark pattern is the following, a rejection in the text. So while it was possible to reject the cookie with one click, it was hidden inside the text with a hyperlink. And we wanted to also employ a dark pattern that is already present but less known, And interestingly also, you see that less than 5% of our participants that were presented with this dark pattern were actually able to defend themselves against it and be able to spot the rejection. But what you see here, and to kind of confirm our first hypothesis, we see that dark patterns do change the acceptance rate, but it really depends on the dark pattern that we're looking at. Because again, the static manipulation did not really have any difference to our baseline design. But let's move forward to the interesting hypothesis of, do privacy preferences actually matter for our choice? And what you see here is basically a regression where we wanted to check what predicts accepting cookies. And what is just important for you now is to look at this highlighted part where we look at the IOPC 8 score. And what is important to notice is that all the coefficients are negative. So that means that privacy concerns that we elicited via this IOPC instrument are always negatively associated with cookie choice. And that was also kind of good for us to see, because people apparently can make some rational decisions and actually act according to their preferences. But now let's move on to our last hypothesis, which was also the most interesting. Again, we checked or wanted to explore the moderating effect of dark patterns on choice, so on preferences. So can, again, people that are very privacy aware, are they able to defend themselves against the dark pattern? And what we find is what I want to show you with this statistical test. So this wall test basically looks into the different relations between IOPC, the privacy preference, and choice according to different banner treatments. But when we compare it to our baseline, we do not actually see any significant evidence for this moderating effect. So we can actually not support our last hypothesis. But we do have an explanation for why this is the case. And for that, I want to show you this plot. What you see here on the y-axis is, again, the acceptance rate, or the predicted acceptance rate. And on the x-axis, actually, the IOPC score. So the higher the score, the more privacy concerns people have. And what you can see with the different treatments is that there's not really like a uniform effect. They all have different slopes. You do see, however, that the higher privacy concerns get, participants are able to defend themselves to some extent. So everybody who is more privacy concerned is less likely to accept cookies. But again, interestingly, we see that these different treatments apparently operate on different psychological mechanisms. Maybe that's kind of our explanation. This is why we do not see the same uniform slope for all of them. But to kind of wrap up and conclude, what we have seen and shown with our study is that banner design substantially shifts acceptance, but only when it really increases the cost of refusing banners. So we kind of, in our paper, differentiate between recognition costs. So for instance, how difficult is actually to recognize the reject button, and the execution costs, how difficult is it to actually execute it. So for instance, with our second dark pattern, you had to actually click twice. So you really have to check kind of the cost of refusing, and it's quite, I would say, depending on the context of the dark pattern. Secondly, and I think that is a super interesting finding, is that we show that privacy concerns consistently predict lower acceptance across all designs. And kind of the implication for regulation, I would say, is that it shows that participants are not entirely powerless against dark patterns. They are able to defend themselves. However, we also don't want to call against any regulation of dark patterns, because as you saw with our last treatment, that was extremely difficult to reject. It can even shift acceptance rate of very privacy sensitive people. And if we can come up with such a dark pattern that is extremely difficult, marketeers can as well. So therefore, we don't want to be completely calling for no regulation of dark patterns, even though, again, people are able to react according to their preferences to some extent. And lastly, we do not find a uniform moderating effect of dark patterns on preferences. But again, we think that is because different dark patterns operate differently. So I think we have to look at every dark pattern individually to kind of come to a conclusion. But that is something that we could not do with this study, but it's definitely interesting for future research. So with that, this is already the end of the presentation. So thanks a lot for listening. I hope you get a good idea of what we aim to do in this study. And we actually already have a working paper ready. So if you want to know more details, we also publish the data as well as the analysis. So you can look in the data yourself. Just scan this QR code and you come to the SSRN page. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Hello, thank you for your presentations, all of you. Well, I wanted to ask if you looked into what the third hypothesis that you had, if you looked into like the behavioral theory about it, because it actually reminded me a bit how you constructed the test. Reminded me a little bit about in behavioral science, I guess it's called, or training I had about it, is that people tend to link their beliefs to the actions that they took. So, for example, if you ask someone to like put their signature under a statement that says "I will not smoke ever again," they're like more likely to actually stop smoking after, because of the signing, like the doing it. So maybe because, of course, I understand that you don't first ask about their preferences and then show them the cookie button, because again, of course, they're all going to look like how to reject it. So that's very logical. But I think the other way around, it's still, if you said yes to it, you're more likely to say, yeah, I don't really care about cookies, because otherwise you would be contradicting your own action from before.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks for this question. But I think because we literally had the link on Prolific for participants very unambiguous on an online behavior study, and then they were already presented with this dark pattern, I think this kind of mechanism is probably not as strong, because I think that's really elicitating what people would have done themselves when they are presented with these cookie banners. So we really try to not prime them in any way. That's why it was also a bit like tricky to not deceive people, but still be able to kind of have this treatment. And that was also a bit like our struggle how to design this experiment. So also then we asked for consent only after they actually already made their choice. And if they were not consenting, we of course deleting their data. But it was a bit of a trick designing this experiment according, of course, to academic standards. But yeah, I hope we really actually got the most neutral or normal reaction that people would have otherwise done to that. But it's a very interesting point. Thanks a lot.
I think you did design it very well, but I think like this, you can never, like maybe if you like put 3 months in between of answering the preference and then the cookie experiment, like if you would let it come, then it wouldn't have an influence maybe. But yeah, of course you have one.
But it's definitely interesting. So it's also nice to like replicate the study again and see, how
if you really want to prove, because I think the hypothesis is should be like, it's logically valid. But
thanks.
So glad to see so much engagement today, but let's hold additional questions for after the next presentation, and we will move to our last speaker of today. And she's joining us online, so if our technical expertise people can help out, yeah?
Right, thank you for sharing the slide. So thank you to the previous speakers. It was lovely listening to all your presentations. And for my presentation, we're going to hop back into, I think, the GDPR analysis kind of scene. And so I'm going to be talking about GDPR from the perspective of comparative analysis of selected ASEAN member states, and with some insights from Japan as well. So if I could go to the next slide, please, thank you. So just to set the scene, for everyone's information, as of 2026 in the Southeast Asian region, the internet penetration rate is about 80.4%, with 500 million internet users. However, this is very varied across the region, and there are still approximately 703.5 million that remain unconnected within the region. So it is obvious that now a lot of regulatory authorities are very concerned about data protection because of the fact that they're viewing digital flows and data flows as a primary factor for GDP. So essentially, my master's research was looking at the different tendencies regarding right to access, beginning with looking in Malaysia, because I'm Malaysian actually, and then comparing it with EU, Japan, and selected states within ASEAN, as well as looking at specifically vulnerable user groups, and if there is a possibility for recommending perhaps frameworks that would look to prioritizing, harmonizing right to access in order to address cross-border data governance issues in ASEAN. So if you could go to the next slide, thank you. So to add a bit more context, ASEAN is a region that is often characterized by something called the ASEAN Way. So it's very different from perhaps the EU or other regions in the sense that the ASEAN Way is built on something called principles of non-interference and consensus-based decision-making. So because of that, there is no supernatural institution, and we cannot have exactly some sort of legislation that you can have enforcement power over the members within the region. So we do have an existing ASEAN framework on personal data protection, and it was mainly to facilitate intra-regional ASEAN member state trade and information law. But this has been quite heavily criticized as being bare bones and not comprehensive. So to go a little bit further as to why I picked to look at Japan's APPI, number one is, of course, as with the first presentation, the speaker did mention, a lot of emphasis on the Brussels effect. There is, within ASEAN, looking at Japan as a reference legislation is, of course, because there have been some look east policies to kind of counter look west policies. So there's been a bit of preference for the global south to perhaps look at what East Asian regions are doing with regards to legislation. And of course, the additional detail of Japan being the first legislation to receive an adequacy decision from the EU. And when we look into a little bit of the background behind the principles and why I thought this analysis would be important is, of course, because the status of privacy is well established as a human right in Europe. So we have to consider, of course, the European Convention on Human Rights. And when you look at Japan, in Japan, the term privacy itself is a foreign term. So if you refer to privacy, you'll be referring to the Japanese term privacy, which is basically a transplanted English term within the language. So from there is a very quite a big gap in terms of the culture, because there is arguably a similar perspective on the individual autonomy, like between the US and Europe. There is a similar perspective on that compared to in the East. So in the East, for example, privacy with regards to Japan is more usually seen in terms of something called amai, which is basically within the group mentality. So it's more about protecting harmony rather than essentially narrowing down or focusing on perhaps the specific rights and of an individual in that sense. So it's a sign of assertion of right as it's quite unusual behavior. So this presumption of goodwill is everywhere in Japanese. And this context, you will see that there is a high level of a need to, for example, do symbolic apologies when it comes to data breaches, which is something that you wouldn't see as commonplace elsewhere. And from this, ASEAN communities and the region may tend to share similarities with the culture that way, even though historically speaking, our legislations have always been influenced by, of course, colonial influence. So moving on to the next part is I primarily wanted to focus on ARCO rights within ASEAN. So ARCO, of course, is the acronym, it's the previous slide, but it stands for the Data Subject Rights of Access, Rectification, Cancellation, and Opposition. So these have been maintained in the GDPR, and also they are an influence across the world. And so my perspective on this is that arguably, in order to access any of the following rights, you do need to first establish that you have a right of access that can be fulfilled. So this is also seen in the OECD guidelines on data protection, which is under the individual participation principle. So looking at the previous table, you can see that one of the main differences that I was trying to highlight was, of course, the time frame within which data controllers have to respond to such requests for access to the data that's being processed in that sense. And so when you're considering this, the GDPR and the APPI have, for example, emphasis on urgency without undue delay. And there are some definitive time limits, for example, 1 month as an extreme limit. But when it comes to tackling delays or postponement of replies, this is where in the ASEAN region, it becomes very murky. So looking at the overall analysis of, how there's a very large difference. For example, you can see 72 hours versus up to 1 month. Another interesting thing is the origin of what this 72 hours was. So 72 hours, the principle behind it was actually with regards to cybersecurity breaches. So because you do need to have a fast turnover rate in terms of if there's a threat identified, are you able to then identify and request that the people in charge are on top of the situation? And so that is why the ideal time frame that is often mentioned is 72 hours as opposed to any other shorter time frame. So the comparisons between the GDPR and the various data protection or privacy laws across ASEAN region is often that there's a more recent shift towards trying to become more complementary towards the GDPR. But I do think that with the region being structured the way it is, the harmonized operationalization of right to access would definitely be a more significant and achievable milestone for the region, because it is unlikely that we'll be able to harmonize across 10 different member states. Even looking at analysis of just 6 is already quite tricky. And of course, that the principal role of the data subject's right to access is, in my opinion, indispensable with regards to cross-border data flows. So, and of course, to revisit the fact that there may be trickle-down effect or a trickle-over effect with regards to data processing for automated decision-making, etc., in which case it does beg the question that ASEAN region perhaps needs to look a little closer towards to what extent this Brussels effect is permeating even already established legislation. Because for a few specific ASEAN member states, they did already have personal data protection legislations in place, but they are working towards making them more GDPR compliant, especially with regards to things like the right to portability. But overall, I think the brief analysis that I was able to do in my paper is that the EU's first mover principle did seem advantageous because it kind of steered towards perhaps preference for certain things. But for ASEAN especially, there is a huge gap with regards to things with legal inconsistencies for children's safety. So lack of standardized minimum age thresholds, or even omission of explicit mention of children within the definitions themselves. So even though since, as I mentioned earlier, there've been ASEAN framework on personal data protection, there's a framework on digital data governance, and another data management framework, all of the above are voluntary, and of course, they do not hold the same amount of influence. The point of it is that I think that the right to access is an enabling right. So even if we were to discount the fact that European legal culture may view the protection of privacy and personal data, with the context of individual and the fundamental rights of the individual, which ASEAN doesn't have in that sense, we do not have like a common or origin story per se. Looking at how Japan has embodied the legal concept, I think is potentially a better bridging reference point compared to perhaps looking straight directly at the GDPR and the EU in this sense. So primarily, I think that if standardization of response timeframes, so including response to the initial request or notification response of a delay or refusal of a request, this is something that can more practically be achieved and negotiated across ASEAN member states. And as such, I do believe that the GDPR legacy per se, as it has come down to ASEAN member states or this select 6, should then be a focus on establishing a minimum fundamental baseline with regards to right to access, particularly focusing on the feasibility and implementation of the time frame with regards to access. And yes, just to emphasize also, even if there is there's a counter argument suggesting that this does rely on the liberal view of the rational actor, and in ASEAN it may be that a lot of these individuals and data subjects will not be able to access this right. The argument is that the avenue to access this right still needs to be upheld and maintained. So yeah, I just briefly went over most of it, and I'll definitely, you can definitely look in detail into the paper later.
Perfect, thank you so much. Do we have a question from the audience? Then we have a question from the moderator. I actually wonder, because you mentioned that concept of individual autonomy, privacy as an individual issue in the West versus more of a collective issue, privacy within group mentality in the East. Could you just explain a little bit what are the key differences that you see there? I'm really interested how privacy is seen in the East, because of my perspective from here, of course.
Right. Thank you for the question. So, of course, I only looked at mainly Japan, and with regards to the transplantation of the word privacy. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is something called AMAE, which is AMAE, and it is not literally, but it can be translated as the presumption of goodwill. So this, in Japanese culture, implied meanings are everywhere, and explicit requests are frowned upon. Basically, you should not be imposing like direct requests on other people, because number one, even if they do have an obligation towards you, you should also be cognizant of this obligation and kind of take care of the fact that they are obliged to do something for you. So there is no perhaps direct, I am deserving of this, you should give me this service in return. So with regards to that, the privacy is basically that there is a personal bubble, is the idea that a personal bubble of yourself should be free from the control of others is not the same, because you should be free to a certain extent, to the extent of which you do not inconvenience the group. Yeah, if I were to put it, if I were to summarize that, it's personal freedom with specific limits, as long as the group is all not inconvenience. That is what I've understood so far through my analysis. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. As we are coming to the end of this session, we have about 2 minutes to ask maybe general questions to any of our speakers. If yes, a question in the back.
Thank you. So, question for Julia about just curiosity. Well, two questions together. First, in terms of, because I understood that your argument is that most of people accept cookies by fearing the cost of, not, for example, accessing the content that a cookie allows, for example, watching a video that is supported on YouTube or whatever. But that sounds like legitimate to me. So do you think about any solution for reducing that cost of users clicking accept? So what can we do to address that? And my second question is pretty similar, but in terms of enforcement. Sometimes I perform like website audits, like analyzing cookie banners and these kind of things, and I see a lot of websites that are not compliant, mainly like the cookie banners, but what can we do, or what's kind of the enforcement? Because there's plenty of websites, but just a few are compliant and like properly compliant. So just a brainstorm about these topics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. So to answer the first one, I think I guess your question goes a bit to this welfare dimension, to really normatively assess if it's good that a lot of people accept cookies or not. But our study actually was not really looking into this dimension, which is, I think, very important. But we really just wanted to check if preferences of users are translated into their choice. So it's not really like a normative argument that we want to make. It's more really like looking into what is actually happening. And to your second question, I think the enforcement is of course key in all of these issues. But I do see that a lot of data protection authorities, especially the French Data Protection Authority, they do amazing work and also have like an own design section, I think, that really looks into what makes people accept cookies and what not, and also have quite interesting guidelines that can also help website design to flourish. But yeah, I think it's ultimately also an enforcement problem in a way. Thank you.
All right, and with that, 1 minute after the time, we end our first academic session. Thank you so much for presenting. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And I hope you enjoyed the conference. And well, we have 2 more academic sessions on Thursday and Friday. So I also invite you to those and have a wonderful time. Thank you so much.